The winter of 1938 settled over New York City like a heavy, gray blanket. The wind coming off the Hudson River cut through the wool coats of the workers on the west side, turning their breath into white clouds that vanished as quickly as they formed. In a neighborhood of brick tenements and iron fire escapes, life moved to the rhythm of factory whistles and the clatter of the elevated trains. It was a time when propriety was not just a choice, but a survival mechanism. In buildings where families lived stacked on top of one another, privacy was a luxury, and the watching eyes of neighbors were as constant as the street lamps. Thomas lived on the third floor of a building on 48th Street, a narrow structure that smelled perpetually of boiling cabbage and damp coal. He was a man of few words, a ledger keeper at a shipping warehouse down by the docks. His days were a cycle of numbers and the rumble of the subway. He was 34, with a face that had begun to show the wear of the decade, quiet and ordinary. Sarah lived on the fourth floor, 2 flights up. She worked as a seamstress in a garment factory a few blocks away. Her hands were often stained with pricked fingertips and ink, and she walked with a posture that suggested she was carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders, though she never complained. She was 29, with hair pinned back tightly and eyes that looked at the floor more often than they looked at the sky. Their worlds first collided in the narrow hallway of their building. The staircase was a dimly lit spiral of worn wood and peeling paint, illuminated by a single yellow bulb that buzzed loudly. It was a shared space, a transitional place where one left the privacy of their apartment and entered the judgment of the public. One Tuesday morning, rushing to beat the clock, Sarah dropped her glove. It fell to the second landing. Thomas was behind her, coming up from the third floor. He stopped, picked up the small gray glove, and held it out. Sarah froze, turning slowly. For a moment, the building was silent. The hum of the refrigerator in the basement and the distant traffic on 9th Avenue seemed to fade. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Thomas nodded. He did not smile broadly, for a smile in a hallway could be misunderstood. He simply inclined his head, a gesture of respect, and continued his descent. Sarah watched him go, her hand lingering in the air for a second before she turned and climbed the stairs to her floor. That was the beginning. There were no introductions, no inquiries of name or occupation. In that time, in that part of the city, such things were not offered lightly. From that day on, a routine formed. It was an unspoken agreement, a silent companionship woven into the fabric of their daily lives. Thomas adjusted his leaving time by 3 minutes. Sarah delayed her departure by 2. They met on the second landing every morning at 7:55 a.m. It was never discussed. It simply happened. They would descend the stairs together, keeping a respectful distance of 2 steps. Thomas walked on the left, Sarah on the right. They did not speak. The air between them was filled with the things they did not say. The sound of their footsteps matching in a slow, deliberate rhythm, the rustle of Sarah's coat, the tap of Thomas's umbrella. Outside, the city was waking up. The streetlights were flickering off as the sun struggled to break through the smog. They would walk to the corner, where the elevated train station cast a long shadow. There, without a word, they would part. Thomas turned left toward the subway. Sarah turned right toward the bus stop. These moments were the highlight of Thomas's day. In the warehouse, surrounded by shouting foremen and the screech of metal, he would close his eyes for a moment and remember the quiet click of Sarah's heels on the pavement. He knew the pattern of the wool coat she wore in winter and the lighter cotton dress she favored in spring. He noticed the days she seemed tired, her steps slower, and he would walk even slower, matching her pace without drawing attention to it. Sarah, too, found solace in these silent walks. In the noisy factory, where women hunched over sewing machines for 12 hours a day, her mind would drift to the morning walk. She felt safe in the silence of their companionship. There were no expectations, no demands. It was a clean, pure form of care that existed entirely in the space between them. However, they were not alone in their building. Society watched closely. Mrs. Gable, the landlady, lived in the ground floor apartment, her front door always open a crack to catch the draft and the gossip. She watched who came and who went. She noticed the timing of Thomas and Sarah. To her, and to the strict social codes of the era, familiarity without marriage was suspicious. Neighbors on the stairs would glance at them as they passed. A shared glance, a held door. These small acts were loaded with meaning. If Thomas carried Sarah's basket one day, people would talk. If Sarah smiled at him, rumors would start up the ventilation shafts like smoke. They lived in a time when a woman's reputation was fragile, and a man's character was measured by his discretion. So, They learned to hide their affection in plain sight. They perfected the art of the neutral glance. On the stairs, they looked straight ahead. Yet, in the reflection of the darkened window pane on the landing door, Thomas would watch Sarah's face. In the shadow of the awning, as they waited for a cable car to pass, Sarah would look at Thomas's shoes, checking to see if he had polished them, imagining his life before he reached the building. One evening in late autumn, a heavy rainstorm soaked the city. The streets turned into black mirrors, reflecting the neon signs of the drugstores and bars. Sarah was late coming home. The bus had broken down. She stood at the corner, shivering under a newspaper, waiting for the traffic to clear so she could cross. Thomas was there. He had been walking back from the library. He saw her immediately. He stood across the street, under the awning of a bakery. He wanted to cross. He wanted to offer her his umbrella. He took a step forward, his hand gripping the handle of his umbrella, but then he stopped. He looked at the figures passing by, men in trench coats, women with their heads down. He saw Mrs. Gable's daughter coming out of the butcher shop nearby. If he crossed the street to walk her home, it would be seen as an act of courtship he could not afford to offer, and an intrusion she could not afford to accept. To the world, they were just neighbors. To acknowledge her publicly in a storm would be to invite questions they had no answers for. So, Thomas stayed on his side of the street. Sarah looked up. Through the rain and the blur of streetlights, their eyes met. It was a distance of only 20 feet, but it felt like a vast ocean. She saw him. She saw the umbrella in his hand. She understood why he didn't cross. A small, sad smile touched her lips, so faint it was almost imagined. Thomas lifted his hat slightly, just an inch, a silent greeting, and a silent apology. Sarah walked home alone in the rain. She was wet, but she felt warm, knowing he was there, watching out for her from a distance. Time, however, is rarely kind to quiet things. The world was changing. The year 1941 arrived, and with it came the rumblings of war that could not be ignored by the ordinary people of New York. The city shifted. The factories began making uniforms and parachutes. The shipping yard where Thomas worked was bustling with military transports. Then came the news. Thomas received a notice. His skills in bookkeeping were needed elsewhere. He was being transferred to a naval office in Washington, D.C. It was not a draft, but a reassignment, a mandatory move to support the war effort. He had 2 weeks to leave. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He walked up the stairs to his apartment, his hand dragging on the railing. He thought of Sarah. He thought of the morning walks, the silent stairs, the shared gaze in the rain. He had never spoken his heart. He had never told her that she was the reason he didn't mind the grey winters, that she was the light in the brick tunnel of his life. The next morning, the routine felt heavy. They walked to the corner as usual. Thomas walked a little slower. Sarah sensed the change. She looked at his face and saw the tension in his jaw. She did not ask. She did not say, "Is something wrong?" That would have broken the unspoken pact of their silence. Instead, she stopped at the corner and turned to face him fully for the first time in years. The traffic light turned red, holding back the cars. Thomas looked at her. He wanted to confess everything. He wanted to tell her that he would write, that he would come back, that she should wait. He wanted to ask for her address, though he already knew the building number. But the city was loud. A siren wailed in the distance. A newsboy shouted headlines about the war. People were watching. A group of soldiers stood on the subway entrance nearby, laughing and smoking. A woman pushing a cart stopped to tie her shoe nearby. To stand and talk on a corner, to linger with emotion in their eyes, was to make a scene. It was to invite the scrutiny of a society that demanded order. Thomas closed his mouth. The words died in his throat. He simply said, "The weather is turning." Sarah looked at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. She understood. She knew he was leaving. She could feel the shift in the air, the way one feels a storm coming before the clouds gather. "Yes," she said softly. "Take care of yourself." "And you," Thomas replied. They nodded to each other. The light turned green. They turned away from each other. Thomas walked left. Sarah walked right. They did not look back. 2 days later, Thomas moved out of the building. He took the train to Washington. He sent no letter, for he had no way of knowing if she wanted one, and he feared that a letter would only bring trouble to her doorstep. He left behind the silence they had built, a structure of empty spaces and hidden feelings. Sarah continued her life. She noticed the empty step on the staircase. The hallway seemed larger, colder. She watched the window in the mornings, but at 7:55 a.m., the street below was just a stream of strangers. She heard from Mrs. Gable that the man on the third floor had gone to help the government. Sarah nodded and went back to her sewing. Years passed. The war ended. The city changed again. The old tenements began to empty as people moved to the suburbs. The neighborhood where they had walked shifted, becoming commercial, the old brick buildings giving way to glass and steel. Decades later, an elderly Thomas returned to the street. He was retired now, his hair white, his steps slower. He stood on the corner of 48th Street. The building was gone. In its place was a tall office tower. The stoop where they had stood was gone. The staircase where they had walked in silence was dust. He looked across the street. The bakery was gone, replaced by a coffee shop. The traffic lights were different, brighter, with symbols instead of words. The city was louder, faster, less patient with silence. Thomas stood there for a long time. He closed his eyes and listened. He tried to hear the click of heels on the pavement, the rustle of a wool coat, the hum of the old streetlight. For a moment, in the quiet of his own mind, the modern city faded away. He felt the presence of the young woman he had never held, the love he had never spoken. He remembered the way she looked in the reflection of the door glass, the way she had smiled at him through the rain. He realized then that what they had was not a tragedy. It was a masterpiece of survival. In a world that demanded to know everything, they had kept something for themselves. They had loved each other by not touching. They had honored each other by staying silent. They had hidden their love so well that even time, eventually, could not find it to steal it away. Thomas opened his eyes. The traffic light turned green. He checked his pocket for his wallet, straightened his coat, and crossed the street with the crowd, just another ordinary man in the city, carrying a memory that was safe, hidden, and entirely his own.